When people think about the Second World War, they often picture tanks rolling across Europe or bombers darkening the skies over cities already under siege. But some weapons never reached the battlefield, yet still managed to leave a deep mark on history. One of them was the Amerika Bomber, Nazi Germany's ambitious plan to build a bomber capable of crossing the Atlantic and striking the United States itself. I'm Knightley. I've spent years walking through war archives, museums, and forgotten airfields, trying to understand not just how wars were fought, but how their ideas survived after the fighting stopped. The Amerika Bomber has always fascinated me because it sits at the edge between reality and ambition. It was never fully realized, yet historians like Richard Overy have described it as a window into how far Germany was willing to go when defeat was already looming. Aviation historian Dieter Herwig went further, calling it a project born more from fear and ideology than practical strategy. So I have to ask you, how close did Nazi Germany really come to bombing America? Was the Amerika Bomber a genuine military threat or a desperate fantasy? And when the war ended, what happened to the plans, the prototypes, and the engineers behind it? Former Allied intelligence officers later recalled that captured blueprints caused real concern in 1945. One U.S. Army Air Forces analyst reportedly noted that while the aircraft was flawed, the intent alone showed a dangerous level of reach. That intent matters, because weapons don't just disappear when wars end. They scatter into archives, into rival nations' laboratories, into the future. Tonight I invite you to explore this story with me, not just as a technical project, but as a symbol of how war reshapes imagination itself. This is the story of the Amerika Bomber, where it came from, what it represented, and what became of it when the guns finally fell silent. So let me ask one last question before we begin. When a weapon is never used, does it still change history? The rise and legacy of Amerika Bomber. Nazi plan for a transatlantic bomber before the war ended. The birth of a legend. Before we can understand what happened to the Amerika Bomber after the war, we must understand why it existed at all. No weapon, especially one as ambitious as this, appears out of nowhere. It is always born from fear, pressure, and belief. The Amerika Bomber was no exception. From the very beginning of World War II, Nazi Germany was obsessed with reach. Blitzkrieg could conquer neighboring countries, but Adolf Hitler and the Luftwaffe leadership dreamed of something far larger, a weapon that could strike enemies far beyond Europe. Britain was difficult enough to reach. The United States, separated by an entire ocean, seemed untouchable. That untouchability frustrated German leadership. The idea behind the Amerika Bomber was simple in theory, but extreme in execution. Build a bomber capable of flying from Europe to North America, delivering bombs to US industrial cities, New York, Washington, Detroit, and either returning or ditching after the mission. Historian Rolf Dieter Müller later wrote that the project reflected Germany's desire to project power symbolically, even when material reality no longer supported it. Development began in earnest around 1942, when Germany was still confident, but beginning to feel pressure on multiple fronts. Several aircraft manufacturers were drawn into the concept, including Messerschmitt, Junkers, Focke-Wulf, and Heinkel. Designs ranged from the Messerschmitt Me-264 to the Junkers Ju-390 and the radical Horten flying wing concepts. The engineering challenges were enormous. The aircraft needed unprecedented range, massive fuel capacity, heavy payload capability, and reliability over flights lasting more than 30 hours. Germany lacked sufficient high-octane fuel, long-range navigation experience, and safe overseas recovery options. Even so, work continued. Why? Because the Amerika Bomber was never just about destruction. It was about psychological warfare. The idea that America could be bombed was meant to shatter the illusion of safety. It was a weapon aimed as much at the mind as at the map. Engineering strengths and fatal weaknesses. On paper, some Amerika Bomber designs were impressive. The Me-264, for example, featured a streamlined fuselage, long wings optimized for fuel efficiency, and heavy defensive armament. The Ju-390, a stretched version of the Ju-290, even completed test flights that reportedly reached the Atlantic. German engineers pushed boundaries. Lightweight materials, advanced aerodynamics, and early long-range navigation techniques were explored. In isolation, these achievements were notable. But reality was unforgiving. Engines overheated. Fuel consumption was unpredictable. Maintenance demands were extreme. And most critically, Germany lacked air superiority by the time prototypes were ready. Allied fighters and radar networks made the survival of such slow, massive bombers highly unlikely. Albert Speer later admitted that the project consumed resources Germany could not afford to lose. Steel, skilled labor, fuel, and research time were all diverted while Germany's cities were being bombed daily. The Amerika Bomber suffered from a fatal contradiction. It required absolute control of the skies, precisely when Germany was losing that control. Political and military motivations. The Amerika Bomber was driven less by battlefield logic and more by ideology and desperation. Hitler personally supported long-range strike projects, believing symbolic attacks could shift morale and political will. Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring, eager to restore prestige after failures over Britain, backed ambitious aircraft concepts as a way to regain influence. Military planners were divided. Some officers argued the bomber was a waste of resources, better spent on fighters and air defense. Others believed even a single successful strike on American soil could force the US to divert resources inward. This internal conflict slowed progress and fractured responsibility. Projects were approved, paused, revived, and redesigned repeatedly. By 1944, Germany no longer had the industrial stability required for such experimentation. Yet the dream persisted. First operational reality, a weapon that never truly fought. Unlike many wartime weapons, the Amerika Bomber never reached combat deployment. There were no bombing runs over America, no cities burned, no air raid sirens across the Atlantic. But this absence does not mean irrelevance. Test flights were closely monitored by Allied intelligence. Reconnaissance photos, captured documents, and interrogations painted a picture of what Germany hoped to achieve. Allied planners took the concept seriously enough to include it in threat assessments, even if they doubted its feasibility. German pilots involved in testing reportedly viewed the aircraft with mixed feelings, awed by its size, but skeptical of its survivability. One test pilot later recalled that flying the Ju-390 felt like commanding a floating fuel tank. The psychological impact, however, was real. American newspapers briefly speculated about transatlantic bombing threats. Civil defense discussions mentioned the possibility, however remote. The Amerika Bomber existed as an idea that unsettled, even without action. Peak influence, when the concept mattered most. The Amerika Bomber reached peak influence, not through use, but through attention. It symbolized Nazi Germany's refusal to accept strategic limits. It also demonstrated how technological ambition could persist, even as defeat approached. By late 1944, Allied bombers dominated German airspace. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Factories lay in ruins. And yet, design studies for long-range bombers continued. Why? Because the project had become ideological. It represented defiance, a belief that innovation could still reverse fate. This is what made the Amerika Bomber iconic. Not fear of its bombs, but fear of what such thinking could produce if given time. Collapse of the old world. As the war neared its end, everything changed. Factories were overrun. Engineers fled or were captured. Prototypes were abandoned at airfields or destroyed to prevent capture. Documentation was hidden, burned, or hastily packed away. The strategic value of the Amerika Bomber vanished overnight, but its intellectual value skyrocketed. Allied forces advancing into Germany found fragments of an unrealized future. Blueprints, engine tests, wind tunnel data. What had once been a dream of domination became a source of knowledge for others. And then, the world changed. The war ended. The battlefield went silent. But the story of the Amerika Bomber had only just begun. The war ends, the fate of Amerika Bomber. Nazi plan for a transatlantic bomber begins chaos of surrender and seizure. The end of World War II did not arrive like a clean full stop. It arrived as chaos. Borders collapsed, command structures dissolved, and vast amounts of military technology were left scattered across a defeated continent. The Amerika Bomber program, already fragmented before Germany's surrender, was swallowed by this disorder. When Allied forces pushed into Germany in 1945, they did not find a completed transatlantic bomber ready for action. Instead, they encountered pieces of a vision: partially assembled airframes, prototype components, engine test rigs, and mountains of documentation. Airfields in southern Germany, Austria, and occupied Czechoslovakia contained abandoned long-range aircraft related to the program, including variants of the Ju-290 and Ju-390. Some facilities had been hastily evacuated. Others were bombed or sabotaged by retreating German personnel. In underground tunnels and dispersed factories, Allied troops discovered crates of blueprints marked Geheime Kommandosasche top-secret material, detailing range calculations, fuel systems, and structural designs. US and British intelligence officers quickly realized that while the Amerika Bomber had failed as a weapon, it succeeded as a technological experiment. Every surviving fragment became valuable. What could not be flown was photographed. What could not be moved was documented. What could not be secured was destroyed. In many cases, the chaos worked in the Allies' favor. German engineers, exhausted and disillusioned, surrendered willingly. They spoke, they explained, they pointed to where the real work had been done and where the most dangerous ideas still lay buried. The power vacuum, with Germany defeated, a new question emerged almost immediately. Who would inherit its ideas? The Luftwaffe no longer existed. German research institutions were dismantled, but the knowledge remained, and the victorious powers were already suspicious of each other. The transition from World War to Cold War began faster than anyone publicly admitted. Initial Allied orders were blunt. Experimental aircraft, deemed impractical, were to be scrapped. Airframes were cut apart. Engines were dismantled. Runways were cleared. Europe needed steel more than dreams of transatlantic bombing. Yet at the same time, secretive collection programs were already underway. The United States launched large-scale technology capture efforts, sending teams of engineers and intelligence officers deep into Germany. The Soviet Union did the same, often operating in parallel, racing to seize facilities before Western forces could arrive. Britain, financially exhausted but technically sharp, focused on documentation and personnel. Each nation feared the same outcome: letting a rival gain exclusive access to German research. The Amerika Bomber became a silent bargaining chip not because it could still fly, but because its conceptual lessons mattered. Engineers, interrogations, and the human cargo machines were only part of the prize. The real value lay in the people who had designed them. German aerospace engineers associated with long-range bomber projects were interrogated extensively. They were asked not just what had been built, but what could have been built if the war had continued. Many admitted that the Amerika Bomber was unrealistic under wartime conditions, but they also emphasized breakthroughs in aerodynamics, structural design, and fuel management. Those breakthroughs caught attention. Some engineers were detained temporarily. Others were quietly relocated. Their past affiliations were overlooked in exchange for future utility. The ethical line was crossed quickly and without ceremony. As one American officer later reflected, "We weren't hiring them for what they'd done. We were hiring them for what they knew." The technology race begins. Within months, the Amerika Bomber stopped being a German project and became a global reference point. Captured blueprints were studied in laboratories thousands of miles apart. Engineers dismantled wing sections, analyzed stress calculations, and debated long-range navigation strategies. Fuel efficiency charts were copied and shared among military research groups. While no Allied nation sought to directly replicate the Amerika Bomber, its influence appeared everywhere. The idea of intercontinental reach no longer seemed theoretical. It seemed inevitable. In the United States, discussions about long-range strategic bombing intensified. In the Soviet Union, interest focused on adapting similar concepts for vast Eurasian distances. Britain examined what could be salvaged for civilian and military aviation alike. What had once been a weapon of war was now a blueprint for the future. From weapon to warning. At the same time, military planners reached a sobering conclusion. The Amerika Bomber was a cautionary tale. It demonstrated what happens when ideology outruns logistics, when ambition ignores sustainability, when symbolic strikes are valued over strategic reality. Reports circulated quietly among Allied commands, emphasizing that such projects consumed enormous resources for minimal practical return. These conclusions would later shape post-war military doctrine, pushing nations to demand clearer strategic justification for extreme weapons. Yet the seed had already been planted. The world had seen that oceans were no longer guaranteed barriers. Distance was shrinking. Technology was accelerating. The Amerika Bomber, though grounded forever, had changed how nations thought about war. A divided legacy. By the end of 1945, the Amerika Bomber no longer existed as a unified program. It had been dismantled physically and intellectually. Some of it lay in scrapyards. Some of it sat in classified archives. Some of it lived on in the minds of engineers now working under new flags. And that division defined its fate. Because while the aircraft itself never flew to America, its ideas traveled far beyond Germany. They crossed borders, they crossed ideologies. And they crossed into a new era where the next war would be fought not just with bombs, but with reach. The war was over. The weapons were silent. But the race they started had only just begun. Where did they all go? When the smoke cleared and the flags changed, the Amerika Bomber did not disappear in a single moment. It fractured. Its remains followed multiple paths, some visible, some hidden, some still unresolved today. This section traces those paths, piece by piece, to answer the question historians still debate. What actually happened to the Amerika Bomber after the war? Scrapped for resources. The most common fate of the Amerika Bomber was also the least dramatic. Destruction. Post-war Europe was starving for raw materials. Cities were rubble. Railways were twisted metal. Factories needed steel more than memories. Experimental aircraft, especially unfinished ones, had no political protection and no practical use. Most were written off within months. Large airframes linked to the Amerika Bomber concept, including Ju-290 and Ju-390 variants, were cut apart where they stood. Wings were severed with torches. Engines were removed and recycled. Aluminum skin, once carefully riveted by skilled hands, was melted down and reused for civilian rebuilding projects. This was not symbolic punishment. It was necessity. Entire airfields were cleared almost overnight. Aircraft that had taken years to design vanished in days. For many prototypes, there is no photograph of their final state-only paperwork confirming their disposal. Historians estimate that the majority of Amerika Bomber-related hardware did not survive even 1 year after Germany's surrender. It became bridges, rails, tools, and structural steel. War turned into infrastructure, and yet destruction alone does not explain everything. Captured by major Allied powers. While most physical remnants were scrapped, the most valuable examples were seized. United States American forces prioritized long-range aviation research. Aircraft deemed flyable were transported to evaluation centers or dismantled for shipment. Components linked to the Amerika Bomber program were studied for endurance, wing loading, fuel efficiency, and crew fatigue management. The US was less interested in copying the bomber itself, and more interested in what it revealed about intercontinental operations. Lessons extracted here fed directly into early Cold War bomber thinking. German documents related to transatlantic navigation, weather forecasting, and fuel optimization were catalogued and archived. Some remain classified or partially restricted to this day. Soviet Union, the Soviet approach was more aggressive and less transparent. In zones under Red Army control, aircraft and engineers were seized rapidly. Facilities were stripped. Equipment vanished eastward with little documentation. The USSR was deeply interested in long-range aviation to cover its vast territory. While no direct clone of the Amerika Bomber emerged, its influence echoed in Soviet strategic bomber development during the late 1940s and early 1950s. United Kingdom. Britain focused on intelligence value, rather than mass capture. British analysts evaluated German bomber concepts critically, often concluding that the Amerika Bomber was an example of strategic overreach. Still, British aviation research absorbed aerodynamic insights and long-duration flight data. France and others. France recovered smaller quantities, mostly documentation and minor components. Eastern European states received scrap and abandoned equipment, sometimes unknowingly dismantling historically significant items simply to meet reconstruction quotas. Each power took what it could, based on capacity and strategic vision. Secret programs and closed doors. Some elements of the Amerika Bomber did not enter public archives at all. They entered black sites. Captured documents were funneled into classified research programs. Test results were compared, recalculated, and recontextualized under new national priorities. Engineers reconstructed hypothetical performance models to answer a single question: how far could this idea really have gone? Facilities in the United States and Soviet Union conducted covert studies on long-range bomber survivability, crew endurance, and emergency recovery scenarios. The aircraft itself was gone, but the problem it tried to solve remained. These programs left little paper trail. Much of what we know comes from declassified fragments and indirect references. The absence of evidence is itself telling. Not everything was meant to be remembered. Museum preservation. Only a tiny number of physical survivors escaped the scrapyard. Museums acquired select airframes and components not because they were useful, but because someone recognized their historical value before it was too late. Even then, preservation was uneven. Some aircraft were stored outdoors, exposed to weather and neglect. Others were cannibalized to keep more famous planes intact. Restoration was expensive, and public interest initially low. Curators faced difficult choices: preserve a symbol of ambition and fear, or focus on machines that actually fought. In many cases, the Amerika Bomber lost. What survives today often does so in fragment sections of wings, cockpit components, engine parts, displayed with minimal explanation. Their significance is easy to miss unless you know what you are looking at. Battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Not everything was recovered. Across Europe, remnants still exist, forgotten, corroding, half-buried. In forests once used as dispersal airfields, metal fragments occasionally surface after storms. In remote military zones, foundations of hangars still stand, silent markers of unfinished projects. Divers have reported aircraft debris in rivers and coastal waters, dumped deliberately to clear space or prevent capture. Some wreckage remains unidentified, its origins debated among historians. Was it a prototype component, a test failure, or merely scrap transported from one site to another? Sometimes hikers stumble across these remains by accident: a twisted beam, a rusted panel, no markings, no context. Silent corpses of a war that ended decades ago. The paper trail that refused to die, while metal vanished. Paper endured. Blueprints, memos, and test logs survived in archives across multiple countries. Some were studied, some were ignored. Some were forgotten until rediscovered by historians decades later. These documents reveal a fragmented truth. The Amerika Bomber was not one aircraft, but a constellation of ideas, many of which outlived the war in unexpected ways. Fuel optimization techniques, long-range crew rotation concepts, structural stress solutions, all of them reappeared, stripped of ideology, repurposed for new conflicts. The bomber itself never crossed the Atlantic, but its paperwork traveled the world. A legacy without a body. So where did they all go? Most were melted down, some were seized and studied, a few were hidden away. Almost none were remembered by the public. The Amerika Bomber became something rare in military history, a weapon whose absence defined its legacy. It did not leave ruins in American cities. It left questions in archives. It left influence without spectacle. It left behind a lesson about ambition, detached from reality. And that lesson would matter far more in the decades to come, when the next generation of long-range weapons would not remain grounded. They would fly. Impact on the post-war world. When the war ended, the Amerika Bomber did not survive as a machine, but it endured as an idea. Its influence was quiet, indirect, and often uncredited, yet it flowed into the post-war world in ways that reshaped military planning, political thinking, and cultural memory. The Amerika Bomber became a ghost concept, haunting an era defined not by World War, but by permanent tension, influence on new military technology. The most immediate impact of the Amerika Bomber was technological, not through replication, but through validation. It proved that intercontinental air power was no longer fantasy. The question was no longer if it could be done, but how efficiently and at what cost. In the United States, strategic bombing doctrine evolved rapidly after 1945. Engineers and planners, already moving toward global reach, now had concrete German data to confirm their assumptions. Long-range fuel management, crew endurance limits, structural fatigue over ultra-long flights. These were no longer abstract problems. They had been tested, calculated, and partially solved. The US Air Force's early Cold War bomber designs reflected this shift. Aircraft were built not just to reach distant targets, but to remain airborne longer, fly higher, and carry heavier payloads with fewer refueling stops. The Amerika Bomber's failure reinforced the importance of logistics, reliability, and air superiority lessons embedded into post-war planning. In the Soviet Union, the impact was equally significant, but ideologically reframed. Soviet military thinkers saw long-range bombers as tools of deterrence rather than shock weapons. German research demonstrated that distance could be conquered, but only through industrial depth and sustained support. This realization pushed Soviet designers toward robust, long-endurance platforms suited for vast territories. Across both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations, one principle became clear: oceans were no longer safe barriers. Air power had become global. Lessons learned. What not to build equally important were the lessons of failure. The Amerika Bomber stood as an example of what happens when ambition exceeds strategic reality. Post-war military planners repeatedly referenced German overreach when evaluating extreme weapons proposals. The bomber's collapse became a case study in resource misallocation. Reports emphasized that technological brilliance means little without fuel, maintenance, trained crews, and secure production lines. Weapons must serve strategy, not ideology. This mindset influenced Cold War doctrine. Projects were subjected to stricter cost-benefit analysis. Reliability and scalability became priorities. The Amerika Bomber, though never named publicly, shaped thinking by what it warned against: psychological and cultural impact. Beyond military planning, the Amerika Bomber left a deep psychological footprint. For veterans, it symbolized a final, desperate phase of the war, a time when Germany chased miracles while cities burned. Former Luftwaffe personnel later described the project with a mix of pride and embarrassment. Pride in engineering skill, embarrassment at its impracticality. For the Allied public, the concept briefly shattered a powerful illusion: that America was unreachable. Even after it was clear the bomber would never fly, the idea lingered. Distance no longer felt absolute. This unease found expression in post-war culture. Books, speculative articles, and later documentaries explored what might have happened had the war lasted longer. The Amerika Bomber became a recurring symbol of near-miss catastrophe, an unrealized threat that still felt uncomfortably close. In modern pop culture, its influence appears subtly. Video games, alternate history fiction, and aviation documentaries revisit the concept, often exaggerating its capabilities but preserving its mystique. The bomber exists today less as hardware and more as narrative. Political effects and propaganda. Politically, the Amerika Bomber became a tool of interpretation. For the victorious nations, it reinforced a narrative of moral and strategic superiority. The project was cited as evidence that Nazi Germany pursued grandiose, reckless schemes at the expense of its own people. It fit neatly into post-war propaganda, emphasizing the rationality of the Allies versus the fanaticism of the defeated regime. For Germany, the legacy was more complex. Post-war governments distanced themselves from such projects, framing them as aberrations driven by dictatorship rather than national will. The Amerika Bomber became part of a broader effort to separate German scientific achievement from Nazi ideology. At the same time, The quiet absorption of German expertise into Allied programs revealed a contradiction. The ideas were condemned publicly while being studied privately. Diplomatically, the bomber's legacy fed into early Cold War mistrust. If Germany had come close to intercontinental bombing, what might a superpower achieve with peacetime resources? This question haunted negotiations, arms limitation talks, and strategic planning for decades, shaping deterrence and doctrine. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Amerika Bomber was its contribution to the logic of deterrence. The project demonstrated that the mere possibility of long-range attack could influence political behavior. Even without a single bomb dropped, the idea had unsettled populations and planners alike. Cold War doctrine embraced this insight. Weapons did not need to be used to be effective, they needed to be believed. This principle shaped bomber fleets, missile development, and later nuclear strategy. Reach became synonymous with power, visibility became leverage. In this sense, the Amerika Bomber was a prototype not of an aircraft, but of a mindset. A shadow that outlived the war. The Amerika Bomber never entered service. It never crossed the Atlantic. It never tested American defenses. Yet its influence crossed decades. It taught engineers what was possible. It taught strategists what was dangerous. It taught politicians how fear could travel farther than bombs. The war had ended, but the presence of the Amerika Bomber lingered, shaping minds long after its engines stopped. Not as metal, not as fire, but as an idea that refused to die. The final survivors. By the time the dust of war had settled and the world began rebuilding, the Amerika Bomber no longer existed as a complete aircraft. There was no preserved fleet, no ceremonial surrender, no final photograph of the project intact. And yet, fragments survived. Not enough to recreate the machine, but enough to keep its memory alive. These survivors, physical and documentary, are the last witnesses to a plan that came close to reshaping global warfare. Catalogue of remaining units. Unlike famous fighters or bombers that filled museums after the war, the Amerika Bomber left behind no officially preserved complete example. What survives today exists in scattered, often overlooked forms. In aviation museums across Europe and North America, components linked to the project can still be found, though rarely labeled as such. Wing sections from Ju-290 or Ju-390 aircraft, engine nacelles, landing gear assemblies, and cockpit instruments remain in storage or partial display. To the casual visitor, they appear ordinary. To historians, they are relics of an unfinished ambition. Some test aircraft connected to long-range bomber development survived briefly after the war, used for evaluation flights or ground testing before being dismantled. Photographs from this period show airframes marked with Allied insignia temporary identities before final disposal. A handful of private collections also hold minor artifacts. Navigation equipment designed for ultra-long flights, structural test pieces, or recovered documentation. These items are rarely publicized, partly due to legal restrictions, partly due to their controversial origin. There are no confirmed restored, flyable survivors. The Amerika Bomber lives only in fragments and records, never again as a whole. The value of survivors today. The value of these remnants is not measured in spectacle, but in context. Historically, they offer insight into how far wartime engineering was willing to push beyond immediate necessity. They show how Germany attempted to solve problems that would not become standard until decades later. Long-range navigation, crew endurance management, structural efficiency at extreme ranges. For researchers, even small components matter. Metallurgical samples reveal material shortages. Stress fractures tell stories of overextension. Navigation tools show the limits of pre-digital flight over open ocean. Monetarily, such artifacts are rare and valuable, though rarely sold openly. When documentation or components surface at auction, they attract serious collectors and institutions rather than casual buyers. Their worth lies in what they represent, not in what they can do. Culturally, these survivors serve as warnings. They remind us that technical brilliance does not exist in a vacuum. It can be bent toward destructive ends as easily as constructive ones. derelict relics, and forgotten remains. Not all survivors are curated. Across former German airfields and dispersal zones, traces still linger: concrete foundations, rusted fixtures, buried debris. In some cases, aircraft parts were simply pushed aside, buried, or dumped into nearby rivers and lakes. Over the decades, nature reclaimed them. Metal corroded, paint faded, context vanished. Occasionally, hikers, farmers, or construction crews uncover fragments, sections of aluminum skin, riveted panels, unidentifiable structural pieces. Without markings, many are discarded or reported without follow-up. These relics exist in a gray zone between archaeology and memory. They are too incomplete to display, yet too significant to ignore. The mystery of the missing units. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Amerika Bomber's legacy is what cannot be accounted for. Archival gaps suggest that not all prototypes, components, or documents were recovered or destroyed. Some were moved hastily during the final months of the war. Others were seized without proper record. A few may still lie undiscovered in sealed tunnels, collapsed factories, or submerged disposal sites. Rumors persist of crates hidden in alpine facilities, of test components shipped east without documentation, of classified files still withheld from public access. While many of these claims are unverified, the incomplete paper trail leaves room for speculation. Historians continue to cross-reference archives from different countries, attempting to reconstruct the full scope of what existed. Each newly declassified document fills a gap, but also raises new questions. The Amerika Bomber in this sense remains unfinished. Not just as an aircraft, but as a historical narrative. Why the survivors matter. The final survivors of the Amerika Bomber are not powerful because they are intact. They are powerful because they are broken. They represent ambition halted mid-sentence. Technology frozen in the act of reaching too far. A future imagined but never allowed to unfold. In museums, archives, and forgotten landscapes, these remnants speak quietly. They do not celebrate achievement, they provoke reflection. They ask the same question the Amerika Bomber has always asked. How much should a nation invest in symbols of power, and at what cost? In the end, the survivors do not tell us what might have happened if the bomber had flown. They tell us what did happen when it did not. And that may be the more important story. Conclusion. War machines are built to destroy, but their stories do not end when the firing stops. The story of the Amerika Bomber reminds us that history is not defined only by the battles that were fought, but by what remains afterward, by the abandoned projects, the unrealized ambitions, and the quiet consequences that follow defeat. The Amerika Bomber never crossed the Atlantic. It never released its payload over American cities. There were no air raid sirens in New York triggered by its engines. And yet, its shadow stretched far beyond the war that created it. It existed at the intersection of fear and imagination, where ideology convinced engineers and leaders that distance could be conquered through will alone. In its rise, the Amerika Bomber embodied Nazi Germany's obsession with symbolic power. It was not just a military concept, but a statement that no enemy should feel safe, no matter how far away. In its collapse, it revealed the limits of that thinking. Technology without resources is fragile. Ambition without strategy is hollow. The bomber failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the world it required no longer existed. When the war ended, the Amerika Bomber did not vanish, it scattered. Its metal was melted down to rebuild shattered cities. Its documents were seized, copied, and archived. Its ideas were absorbed by nations that would soon face each other across a divided world. In that transformation, a weapon of intimidation became a source of knowledge. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of post-war history. The victors condemned the ideology that created the Amerika Bomber, yet quietly studied the science behind it. Engineers who once worked for a defeated regime found themselves contributing to new military programs. The line between justice and pragmatism blurred, as it often does in the aftermath of total war. The impact of the Amerika Bomber can be seen in the decades that followed. Long-range bombers became central to Cold War doctrine. Deterrence replaced invasion. Reach replaced proximity. The lesson was clear. Power was no longer measured only by armies at borders, but by how far a nation could project force without crossing them. Yet there is another lesson here, one that goes beyond strategy and technology. The Amerika Bomber shows how fear can accelerate innovation and how desperation can distort priorities. While cities burned and defenses collapsed, resources were poured into a project that could not change the war's outcome. It stands as a reminder that technological brilliance does not guarantee wisdom. For those who lived through the war, the bomber became a footnote, a strange idea from a dark time. For historians, it became a case study in ambition divorced from reality. For future generations, it remains a warning wrapped in blueprints and fragments of metal. As I walk through museums, abandoned ruins, and forgotten airfields, I'm reminded why I tell these stories. Not to glorify the machines, but to listen to what they still have to say. Every relic has a voice, every wreck carries a memory, and every weapon, no matter how destructive, reflects the choices of the people who built it. The Amerika Bomber speaks softly now. It does not roar through the sky. It does not threaten cities. Instead, it asks us to look back and consider how easily imagination can be weaponized, and how difficult it is to control once it is unleashed. History is full of machines that changed the world by being used. The Amerika Bomber is different. It changed the world by almost being used, and that difference matters. If you want to continue this journey with me through forgotten bunkers, lost prototypes, and the silent bones of history, join me. There are countless echoes of war still waiting to be heard, scattered across landscapes and archives alike. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening, and for remembering. And before we move on, I want to hear from you. What story should we uncover next? What forgotten weapon, abandoned idea, or hidden chapter of history should we explore together in the next episode? Because as long as there are questions left unanswered, the past is never truly silent.